Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben Dubose here, Paolo Alves there. Welcome into another episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing, their beer developed in collaboration with your Houston Rockets. Since we last recorded at the end of January, it has not been an ideal time to be a fan of the Houston Rockets. As we're recording this on Tuesday, the 11th of February, the Rockets are figuratively and literally limping their way into the All-Star break. They are just 1-6 in their last 7 games. Fortunately, they snapped the 6-game losing streak with a relatively uninspiring win over the Toronto Raptors at home on Sunday. Amongst the expected rotation players, more than half are currently limited by injury in some way. Jabari Smith hasn't played since the start of January with the fracture to his left hand. Fred VanVleet hasn't played this month after straining his ankle. Both of those guys won't be back until the other side of the All-Star break. Rockets have 2 more games this week coming up against the Suns and the Warriors on Wednesday and Thursday at home. I think they need to win at least one of those when you look at a more challenging schedule coming out of the All-Star break. But they've also been without Alperen Sengun for a stretch, missed 3 games with a calf contusion, and then had back spasms early in Sunday's game, only played a couple of minutes. And then Steven Adams and Tari Eason are playing through some nagging injuries and on back-to-backs, which the Rockets have a lot of in the near future, including this past weekend. They seem to be limited for the time being to half of those. So between Fred, Jabari, Sengun, Steven Adams, Tari Eason, that's more than half of your expected rotation that is either out altogether for multiple games or is limited in some way. And with Steven and Tari, obviously, they're not going to play much beyond 25 minutes, even when they are able to play. So this is a Rockets team. It's not meant to say that it's all due to injury, this recent downturn, but that certainly had a lot to do with it. It's just been sort of a whiplash effect to go from when we last recorded at the end of January. By the way, congratulations to Ime Udoka, Western Conference Coach of the Month. Amin Thompson, Western Conference Defensive Player of the Month for January. Just an incredible month where you had big-time wins, 2 over the Cavs, 2 over the Grizzlies, 1 over the defending NBA champions in Boston. So many awesome things happening. And then to feel it abruptly shift on the fly to a 6-game losing streak and 1 of 6 since that back-to-back in Boston and Atlanta, it's rough. And so I think there's a lot of ways you can look at it. Again, the injuries are a leading storyline, and the other day, Ime Udoka, in his press conference at Toyota Center, said that he thinks that's primarily what's thrown the Rockets off rhythm. However, some of the guys that are out there that have been playing, like Amin Thompson, to a lesser extent Jalen Green, aren't quite what they were when we last recorded a couple of weeks ago. Now, it could be that the injuries are affecting them by making it harder for them to have the space or opportunities that they once did. You can make that argument. But regardless, there's a lot going on here. Injury is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And I think you can argue that the Rockets have been a below-average defensive team since the calendar flipped to 2025. Perhaps Jabari Smith's injury plays into that. Well, I'm sure it does to some extent. It's just a question of how much. But there's a lot going on here. And so, Paolo, I guess my question to you is how should we contextualize and process all of this? Because there's been a bit of a whiplash effect for a lot of people, including certainly me. I was out on the road trip in New York and seeing, especially the Brooklyn game that they quite literally threw away in the closing seconds. You know, some of those 6 losses were of the tip your hat variety. I thought the Rockets played well in Madison Square Garden, but Jalen Brunson put the Knicks on his back. Anthony Edwards in Minnesota did the same. To some extent, Anthony Davis in Dallas, while he didn't finish the game due to injury, him being brilliant in the first 3 quarters is what gave the Mavs that lead. So some of the losses, the tip your hat variety, also some of it, the Rockets just giving it away with uncharacteristic mistakes, 2 losses to the tanking Brooklyn Nets. So there's a lot of things going on, but from a 30,000 foot view, what have we learned over these past couple of weeks of brutal Houston Rockets basketball, and how should we feel about this team relative to when we last recorded?
So I actually think my overall thoughts on it do not match what you'd see on my Twitter feed if you were watching the games along with me. I think I was obviously overreacting. I mean, I typically live tweet the games. So if you want true analysis, you'll probably find better analysis in the mornings rather than at the nights of the games. Especially because it's especially emotional for me because there's a lot on the line. If I stay up to watch a game and the game is garbage, I can't really go to sleep if I start watching the game because adrenaline's running too high. And so I'll be miserable in the morning when I get up to go to work. So I'm double as mad as somebody else would be. But I will say, I think the game against the Grizzlies, we could have won. We put up a good fight against a good team. Same thing against the Knicks. Same thing against Timberwolves up until Anthony Edwards just went off on us. Which, by the way, he's 0 for 6 in 8 minutes against the Cavs. His team has scored like 3 total points. So I guess we just couldn't be the ones to get the reverse side of the coin with him. But I will say, in general, for the Rockets, I think it hurts to watch them kind of flounder out of the fight for the 2 seed, but it's not necessarily something that it wasn't kind of expected. I thought I tweeted before. I think the Nets game that if we didn't win that game, we'd probably be out of the fight for the 2 seed by the time that we caught back up with our level of play.
And let me do a quick reset in the standings because they're 33 and 20 after this recent stretch. So they're 3 games back of the Grizzlies for the 2 seed, although the Rockets do have the tiebreaker there. They are only 3 games up over the Clippers, who are the current number 7 seed, and that would mean play-in range. However, the Rockets do have the tiebreaker there as well. One thing the Rockets have done well is play especially well against teams in this narrow band of 2 through 7 or 8 in the West, really 2 through 7, because the Mavs are at 8 and they have 25 losses. And now Anthony Davis looks like is out for a month. So I would say 2 through 7, the Grizzlies at 17 losses, Nuggets at 19, Lakers at 19, although they played fewer games, Rockets 20 losses, although by win percentage, they're slightly in front of the Lakers as of our recording time. Timberwolves and Clippers each with 23 losses. So there's this band of which they have now a 3-game deficit for the 2 seed, a 3-game lead over the teams in the 6 and 7, and then tightly bunched with the Nuggets and Lakers in the 3 through 5. Go on.
Yeah. So I think it will be very tough for us to go back and fight with the Grizzlies unless injuries happen. But it's not as dramatic, and I think as people are making out to be, and as I was making out to be, because all in all, what really matters is that you don't fall. I think even 6th is probably as long as we don't fall below 6th, I'll be okay. As long as we avoid Nuggets, Thunder, and Grizzlies in the first round, although the Grizzlies, we've beaten them. I think I'll be okay. And the most important thing to me is getting to the playoffs fully healthy. I think this team has been just completely destroyed by injuries and key players as well. Fred brings something that we don't have anybody else on the roster that can bring the same thing. Şengün has been out for a few games. I think it's just back spasms now, so maybe he'll be back by the time we play the Suns. And I think you can't really discount the fact that Jalen Green's very clearly playing hurt. He's very clearly hanging on to that 160 or whatever it may be games played streak, and he, it's I don't know what injury he has, but it's clear that it bothers him.
It's a
So
contusion to his knee. And I think with so many other guys out, quite frankly, they had to win that Toronto game, and they don't if Jalen doesn't play. Let's be honest. If he's not out there in the fourth quarter, they don't turn that around and salvage it on the second day of a back-to-back. And so I think part of it's the streak, but part of it's all these other injuries piling up, and they desperately need a win. And so he just needed to be out there. And by the way, one criticism of the Rockets that I think is fair from sort of a management perspective is how they're staggering or not staggering in some cases these absences on the back-to-backs, because the loss they had in Brooklyn, and what's most frustrating to me about this recent stretch is if you could just flip the 2 games they lost to the Nets and they're 3-4 in these last 7, we'd all be okay and understanding of it. The extent of the struggles and the abrupt fall off from number 2 in the West, they were, I think, at number 2 in the NBA.com power rankings, now 7 or 8 overall, 4 or 5 in the West, depending on the day. The extent of the fall was because you stacked losses. You could have avoided that if you simply prioritized beating the Nets and, for example, used Tari Eason on that half of the back-to-back instead of in Madison Square Garden against the Knicks, a team that without Şengün, without Fred, without Jabari, you were unlikely to beat even if you played at your best, which to the Rockets' credit, they did. They led for a lot of that game before Jalen Brunson took it over down the stretch. So if you're the Rockets and you can load up for some of these easier teams, and the same could be said for the way they managed the Mavs Raptors back-to-back, they played Steven and Tari on the front end, not on the back end. And so because of that, that put a little bit more pressure on someone like Jalen to say, hey, I need to be out there because if not, we could lose this game and we could be on a 7-game losing streak. And that would be freaking terrible for a team that looked at itself as something of a contender as recently as the start of this month. Now, I don't know if we fully bought in on them being a contender, but I think internally there was, at least in the locker room, that degree of confidence, that degree of swagger. You want them to believe if they're beating the best teams in the NBA, which they were. And so I think the streak for Jalen is part of it, but also it just comes down to they needed him to win that game. And without Jalen being out there, even a limited Jalen, they're not able to do it. I think your larger point is valid, Paolo. I just wanted to jump in and sort of give some of the background there.
Yeah, I think perhaps not necessarily right now, because I do agree with you. We don't win those games without him, because as inefficient as he might have been, it was the difference between inefficient and just not scoring at all. Because nobody was. Jeff Green had a career night, and that kind of saved us there in the fourth quarter. Like, we had nothing going. Kem Whitmore made a couple of really tough threes late down the stretch, but he was like 1 for 7, 1 for 8. Like, nobody could put the ball in the basket. The man had one shot at the half. And, there is something to just getting a bad shot up versus not getting a shot up at all, which happened a lot. Or just, a tough shot for Jalen is better than a tough shot for basically everybody else on the team, because he's kind of the only one that can kind of make them, even if they're not at, normal efficiency standards. That being said, my biggest overarching point is the fact that as long as they get healthy, we've seen that the system works, and the fact that Jabari got injured showed us that the system can work even better with Aman Thompson in place of Dylan Brooks. And I think I'd be confident saying that I think when Jabari comes back, if he is as good as he was before, he is as important as he was before, that Dylan will go to the bench. I think Dylan's just been playing terribly. We saw this last year. Efficiency kind of fell apart, and he's just taking terrible shot after terrible shot. Although the offense is doing it in general, but Dylan's just not making any of them. Like, for Dylan, there's good fadeaways and bad fadeaways, and you can tell by the time that he's going to shoot if it's a good one or a bad one. If it's those short ones, he sometimes makes them. If it's the long ones, he doesn't make a single one of them. It's just crazy. Sorry, to get back to the point. As long as they get healthy, I think Jabari's impact is really underrated. And I think simply what happened was, well, in January, Jalen Green was unconsciously hot. And we've talked about on this podcast time and time again that the difference between us having a good half-court offense or a bad half-court offense is how good Jalen Green's playing. And so if you have a good half-court offense, you don't really rely on as much on the defensive rebounding, the offensive rebounding, the stops, and the extra opportunities that come from rebounding. When Jabari went down, Jalen started to pick it up. And so you were still winning games because you were no longer that terrible half-court offense as you were prior to that. And now Jalen has come back to earth, right? He, on his good games, will score high volume on 55% true shooting, which looks like something like 24 points on 21 shots and 2 free throws or something like that. But that's no longer enough from a half-court perspective, especially without Fred there and without Şengün for some of the other games. And you've also lost that rebounding component to it. And I think we kind of saw with Steven Adams and Alperen Şengün, which, was really surprising, although it should have, because Ime has played Robert Williams and Al Horford together. Robert Williams and don't quite recall who the other center was with the Celtics back then. Maybe it was Al Horford.
Yeah, it was. It was
It was?
Robert Williams, Al Horford. Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Because nowadays I kind of think of Al Horford as more of a spacer than he was back then, although back then he could kind of do it.
And by the way, we will talk before the episode wraps up. I should have set up the lead with this, but the relatively quiet trade deadline, Rafael Stone making a couple of deals to sort of build back up the future asset pipeline, hashtag asset management, by taking on bad contracts or second round draft picks, but not really bringing in any upgrades to the current team, be it star level or rotation level. I know Robert Williams was one guy who was specifically mentioned potentially as an option for the Rockets. We will get into that before the episode winds down. Just want to start by talking about the, abrupt change in fortune for the team on the court. And then before we wrap up, we'll get to the trade deadline and everything that comes with that.
Yeah, 100%. And so just to put a bow on it, I'll just say it makes all the sense in the world. Like, it's easy to explain what happened here. You had a team that was highly reliant on offensive rebounding, on defensive rebound, on second half opportunities, and then in transition buckets because the half-court offense sucked. And then you lost a lot of that component of the team, but you gained on fire Jalen Green that got your half-court offense to an acceptable level. And so you could, and that plus the Amen Thompson boost, you could now just win like a normal elite team. And then Jalen came back down to earth. I mean, Thompson is really good still, but it's situational, well, when he can be used as an offensive option or not. And that, coupled with the injuries that we've had, has caused this slide to happen. What I'm looking for right now, it's just, let's just survive until the deadline with no more injuries. If we can play 500 ball until the deadline, I'll take it.
The All-Star break, you mean?
Until the All-Star break, I'll take it. And hopefully during that time, these guys can take a moment to really get back to as close as they can to 100%. Hopefully Jabari will be able to play after the All-Star break. And then we truly see what this team's made of, because that will probably be the best version of this team that we have seen all year, because you will have Jabari, you will be able to start them in, and you will have all of those injuries back, and hopefully we will have a more kind of a less worn out Jalen Green, because 160 games sounds impressive, but these last few games, everything's on him, right? Jalen has to be a part of every single possession. He has to, and he's obviously doesn't have the frame of an Anthony Edwards, and he's having to play through contact. He's having to, play a lot of minutes, and hopefully he gets a little bit of rest. So, as I said, all in all, let's just survive until the deadline. Let's at least play 500 basketball. Let's be, within 4 games, I'll call it, of the 2 seed, and hope that it's not too late by the time the All-Star break has passed, so that we can kind of bounce back, because it's not hard to explain why this team has had kind of the fall from grace that it has. It's also that they got a lot better really, really quick. And it's kind of understandable that once you lose a couple of pieces, the entire scheme falls apart, because you don't have your Anthony Edwards, your Luka Doncic, the guys that can, regardless of what the team is around them, just carry the team through the finish line and make up for some of those losses. It's kind of the entire group makes every single piece of itself a lot better. And as you lose more and more pieces, that effect goes away. I'll call a Texans reference, since it's post Super Bowl, and I'll say that swarm mentality that I think also characterizes the Rockets kind of fell apart a little bit because of the lack of talent. But yeah, that's my 10,000 foot view. It's nothing to panic about. I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, and I will note that even after the Toronto game, Rockets still have the second easiest schedule in the West for the remainder of the season. The only team with an easier schedule is Dallas, and they're not going to have Anthony Davis for several weeks, it looks like. So all in all, they're still in a pretty good spot. And fortunately, they won all those games in January, even in a stretch that looked very difficult on paper, because that's given them a buffer to where even after losing 6 straight games, they're still in a pretty decent spot. I think at the end of the day, we would both agree, or correct me if I'm wrong, Paolo, but as long as they get to the playoffs, it's a success, or at least has a reasonable opportunity to be a success. Now, if they get swept in the first round and lose by like 25 points a game, like that's silly. But the whole idea of not making a big move, and we'll get into this when we talk about the trade deadline, but the idea is to use this season to gather more information about the young core, stress test them under high leverage situations. I think at a bare minimum, and this is still very much in play, you want to get to the playoffs, get at least one best of 7 series. And we've talked about, do they go out in the first round? Do they advance deep into the playoffs, potentially the Western Conference Finals? A lot of it's going to depend on matchups. It's the last home versus road. Obviously, you'd like for the Rockets to be in a position where they have home court advantage, but this is a team that's played well on the road. Quite frankly, you might prefer, instead of being 4-5 and being on the side of the Thunder, to where with the bracket, you would play them in the second round. Maybe you'd be better off at 6 so that you're not slotted to play Oklahoma City in round 2, depending on who you draw in round 1. But I guess, are we in agreement that as long as you avoid the play-in tournament, because the play-in tournament puts you in a world where you could be out in a game or two, as long as you get to a best of 7 series and have a reasonable showing, at that point, you've accomplished your primary goals, right?
Yeah, I think you get a top 6 seed. You get a B. You get a top 5 seed. As long as the Lakers are the 4 seed, you get a B plus. You get a top 3 seed. You get an A. That's what happened.
Yeah. Okay. So with the buffer they gave themselves by starting 32-14 and getting to the number 2 seed, to where even with things falling apart like they have lately, to still be in a decent spot as of our recording time, number 4 in the West, although they may fall to number 5 in a little bit, depending on what happens with the Lakers game later on with the Luka debut. All in all, it's a pretty decent spot, all things considered. And another reason to be optimistic, most of their injuries are the type that, especially with over a week of rest over the All-Star break, the last game before the break is this Thursday, the 13th. They don't play again until Friday, the 21st. Most of their injuries are not of the soft tissue variety. With Jabari, obviously, it's the broken bone in his left non-shooting hand. With Jalen Green, it's a bruise to his knee. With Alperen Sengun, now we'll see what happens with the back, but it's primarily been a bruise to his calf. It's not the Anthony Davis type injuries that can linger, not just from the standpoint of how long they're out, but how effective they are when they come back. Because we all know with soft tissue injuries in the NBA, sometimes it can take until the off season for them to fully heal. I will be watching that carefully with Fred VanVleet in particular, but for the most part, we're talking about bone issues, bruises. With Jabari, his non-shooting hand. So I think these are the types of injuries that when they are healed, and with Jabari, thankfully, he's been able to keep up with his conditioning because obviously it's not a lower body injury. I think these are the types of injuries that, while frustrating now, by and large, they'll be all systems go when they return on the other side of the All-Star break. And with Fred perhaps being the only exception to this, well, I guess you can say Steven Adams and Tari Eason are exceptions as well for different reasons. Tari, because he's had ongoing issues with the leg. But I think those are guys with a slightly lower role. It's not as important than being full health because you can scale down the role a little bit if you need to and still use them in some capacity. It's the 35 minutes per game tier guys that you need to be at full health or as close to it as possible. And in the case of guys like Jalen and Jabari and hopefully Sengun, I think by and large, after the All-Star break, they'll be themselves. And so we'll have something closer to the version of the Rockets that we saw in January when they were at their best and they were winning these awards and they were stacking wins over really good teams. To your point on how it all fits together, I think Ime Udoka has had some really revealing comments in recent days that I want to highlight. After the loss in Minnesota, he commented on it being great to have a guy, or would be great because the Rockets don't, someone like Anthony Edwards that can just take over a game down the stretch. And then prior to the Toronto game, when the Rockets got back to Houston, part of this, I think they were a bit road weary. They had played 8 of 9 away from Houston, a lot of back-to-backs, a 5-game and 7-day stretch. So there were a lot of things that were adding up on top of the injuries. And so with the team being on the road so much, there hadn't been a lot of media availabilities with reporters here in Houston. Sunday there was, so we got to catch up with Ime on some bigger picture topics. And he mentioned a term that he used at least twice called a fragile ecosystem. And he didn't elaborate too much on it, but I think it's what he's referring to with that is many of the dynamics that you just laid out, which is that when you don't have someone like an Anthony Edwards that at least consistently can take over games. Now, for a stretch in January, Jalen Green did that. And I guess you can argue Amen did for a few games as well, certainly in Boston. But I think, with Jalen, it's the knee contusion. With Amen, I mean, he's just year two, so there's going to be a lot of ups and downs and volatility to his performances. You can also argue that maybe playing him in 40 minutes per game instead of the 30 to 35 that he was at before, that might be overextending him just a little bit to where you can't get the peak version, especially, well, I say especially offensively, but defensively as well. I think there's been some fall off there that hopefully can be improved once he goes back to a more normal usage pattern when you get Jabari back. But I think the idea is that when the Rockets had those big games, it largely came at a point in which you had Jalen and Amen being transcendent. And now that, it's not that either of them has fallen off hard. Jalen's still been pretty good. It's not like he's gone back to November form or the first half of last season when he was bad. But even if he just goes back to being a good player, but not a great player, it's not enough to overcome the issues defensively with all the pieces they've lost, their propensity to have more turnovers now that you don't have Fred VanVleet to help organize you on both ends of the court. The transition defense has gotten leakier. You just don't have that one guy that can overcome it. And so I think that's what Ime is referring to with his fragile ecosystem comments, especially in light of the comments he had about Anthony Edwards and it being great to have a player like that can just take over a game. And when you need a bucket, when it gets tight in the fourth quarter, you can trust him to go out and make a play. And I think that's something that, in Houston, we've been spoiled over certainly the James Harden years, but especially James Harden, Chris Paul, then James Harden and Russell Westbrook. I know we joke about it, but Russ still was an all-star for that one season that he was in Houston. You had multiple guys that it's not that the team concept didn't matter. Obviously, you needed enough versatile defenders to where you didn't get cooked. You needed enough floor spacing to where James and Russ or James and Chris could go out and do their thing. But ultimately, you wanted to give one or two guys an opportunity to be transcendent, to be great. And that's what a lot of Houston Rockets basketball was over the past decade. And you can even go back before that with, Tracy McGrady and Yao Ming, obviously the 90s with Hakeem and Clyde. This is an organization and a fan base that's become accustomed to having transcendent star level players, at least when healthy. And when they haven't been healthy, then, well, we pointed to that and said, well, if not for Chris Paul pulling his hamstring at the worst moment. Right now, that you don't have a player of that caliber. Now, we've talked a lot about the strengths of sort of this sometimes you, sometimes me, always us approach, this mantra that the Rockets have adapted. They're less predictable. And in theory, you're not at a point where one injury, one ill-timed hamstring pull can cripple you the way it did with Chris Paul. But the problem is your ecosystem becomes very interconnected because you don't have that one guy that can lift you above the sum of the parts. So if you're missing Jabari's impact with his size as far as your defense, your switchability, your rebounding, and all of a sudden that prevents your defense from being, the top 5 foundation that it was for most of the first 2.5 months of the season, then there's a whole chain of ripple effects. And I think that's what we're seeing. When you don't have that transcendent type of player, and, congratulations to Alperen Şengün on being an all-star for the first time, but he has not been an all-NBA player this season. That's the type of difference maker I'm talking about, especially with the amount of shots he's missed near the rim. We've talked about him missing bunnies, and perhaps the injuries there are a factor as well, the calf and now the back. The point is, when you don't have that one player that can lift you up the way Anthony Edwards or Jalen Brunson did during this recent skid for the Rockets, Anthony Davis with the Mavs as well, then all of a sudden these little things like the organization and the limiting turnovers of Fred VanVleet, the defense, the rebounding, the switchability of Jabari Smith Jr., when you take pieces like that out of the chain, it becomes much more pronounced when you don't have a James Harden or a Chris Paul or even a February 2020 Russell Westbrook to lift you above it. And for a time in January, the Rockets had that with Jalen Green and Amen Thompson. Neither one of them has become a dramatically different player this month, but even just a slightly reduced version of what they were in January, when combined with losing these other elements in the chain, it's led to a lot of coin flip games that went their way in January, all of a sudden not going their way in February. So I think that's what Ime is referring to here. And that's why I think there's hope that once you get back to full strength, and, we hyped up during the year the depth, the guys they have at the 10 through 14 spots on the bench, like Jeff Green, like Jock Landale, like Jay Tate, like Aaron Holiday. Kudos to Jeff and Jock for getting them a win over the Raptors. But I think especially against better teams, losing guys like Fred and Jabari, even if your 10 through 14 are better than 10 through 14 on other teams around the NBA, at the end of the day, it's not Fred and Jabari. It is a hit. I think, part of what's happened, and this is sort of how I've made peace with it myself, the Rockets were pretty fortunate with injuries the first 2.5 months. I know they had the situation with Tari, but we largely expected some of that going into the year after what happened a season ago. And he's never been a piece that's played above 25 minutes per game anyway. By and large, the Rockets had been healthier than a lot of their rivals in the West for the first couple of months of the year. Obviously, that's flipped over the past month. Now everyone's at parity. And, I keep telling myself, look, if someone had told me before the season started that, hey, February 10th, they're going to be 33-20, number 4 in the West, would you take it? I think everybody would take it. It's just coming off of 32-14. That's why it feels the way it does right now. Or perhaps some of this is, the Rockets getting the same bad luck with injuries that everybody does, or most teams do, over a season. And now they're sort of coming back to where they should be, given the composition of the roster, where they are in the rebuild, all of that. So for me, that's what I think Ime is referring to with the whole fragile ecosystem. It's that when you don't have that Anthony Edwards level guy, you can't as easily overcome the issues in the chain to where, if the same thing had happened 5 years ago where you lose a role player for a few games, well, okay, James Harden can just go out and bail you out and keep you afloat to where you don't really feel it in the standings as much. And right now, it's just the way the roster is put together, and especially with Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, and Amen Thompson all dealing with some nagging injuries and not being at that level to begin with, it's just not realistic for the Rockets as currently constructed to overcome it. I think that's what he's referring to. I think that sort of meshes with your comments on the injuries and how that's played into the recent slide. Anything else you want to add on that before we turn our focus to the trade deadline?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think when you quote it in a tweet, right? I'm referring to the. It's nice to. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's nice to have someone who can go and get the buckets or whatever, or have a go-to guy, whatever it may be. That Yudoka said. It read a lot more passive aggressive than I think it was. Like if you listen to me Yudoka speak, it's more of a I don't think it was kind of a shot at Rafael for us not having it. I think it was more of a challenge to the young guys that we have, that like, hey, we need this guy. So which one of you is going to become this guy?
And that's why I think it's important to mention that comment with the additional context from a couple of days later of the fragile ecosystem, because I think those are interconnected in terms of what he's referring to. It's not so much that he's saying, oh, Rafael needed to go get me that guy right now. It's also just sort of explaining why it's more difficult with the pieces they have and what they're trying to do with these young guys.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a perfect segue for the trade deadline talk, because that's exactly why I would have wanted a guy like a Robert Williams, or maybe one of those like periphery of the rotation type of pieces. But I didn't quite want a big trade for a big star. And then with the trade deadline, and if you go on Twitter especially, what you'll see the most is you'll see people see other teams get guys and get overly excited about what the concept of a guy may look on a team, and have that fear of missing out. And, the NBA at the deadline especially is just a lot of drama. And you'll see just people just say crazy stuff and forget the point in the rebuild of where we're at. And you touched on this on your previous point, which is there's so much, and I kind of wish people look at it this way. There's so much data to collect on the team that we currently have, that if you go and get someone, you might be putting yourself in a position that if you get someone, they're going to take minutes away from somebody else, and you might move that somebody else while they have value, because if you're not going to play them, it would make sense to move them. And the worst feeling in the world for a team that tanked for 3 straight years is to feel that they let the guy that they shouldn't have let go, they let him go too early. Because even if it's Jalen, which is the guy that's gotten the most chances, the most opportunities, if Jalen went to another team now and turned into Donovan Mitchell, it would sting so much as a Rockets fan. If Opportunity was obviously already good, but if this happened with Jabari Smith, what if Jabari Smith all of a sudden turned into Chris Bosh-like, or hell, call it Jason Tatum-like? I know it probably won't happen, but you can make the argument for a lot of the guys that we have currently on the roster. And how much differently would you look at a guy like Jalen Green if all of a sudden in the playoffs he's just a killer? Like, he's one of those guys that when it comes to the playoffs, the lights are brightest and it just clicks for him. Like, he's just better in that situation. Like, Jimmy Butler is okay in the regular season. Jimmy Butler in the playoffs is a god. And so you really don't know either Jalen, Jabari, even a man, which we know is good in any setting. But let's say even Sengun, who's already good, if he goes to the playoffs and he's just a machine, like, you can't stop him from scoring 30 and having 6 assists a game. Like, we don't know until we see it at the very least once. And even if you went and got a guy like Colin Sexton, that's probably going to take minutes away from guys either on the bench or even Jalen Green's minutes in some situation. I just want to see, like, there's just this enormous amount of data that we haven't collected, and just one playoff series can give us so much. Obviously, it will still be a very small sample, but at that point, it just like, how these guys perform in the playoffs is just a completely different world than how they will perform in the regular season. Now, it might be the same for a lot of guys, but you have to see it before you make a major move like that. And just think about all of the stars in the NBA, right? And how their performance in the playoffs completely shifts the opinion that we've had of them as star players, right? Look at even James Harden, for example, or look at a guy like Jason Tatum, or look at a guy like Joel Embiid. Like, if you took Joel Embiid purely off his regular season numbers and perhaps not the injuries, you'd think like, oh my God, this guy's one is like top 3 player in the league. But when you factor in how he performs in the playoffs, different conversation. Look at Paul George. If Paul George was regular season Paul George in the playoffs, he'd probably have a few rings, and you'd probably be talking about him in the same breath that you're talking about James Harden. And hey, you could probably make the argument if he had like 3 rings, and I think that he could have if he were that good of a player in the playoffs. Now you'd be talking about him in the same breath as, Kevin Durant or someone like that. It's just so different. Like, guys in the regular season and the way guys play in the playoffs just makes such a massive difference that you really can't feel good about yourself, not at least giving yourself a chance to collect that information before you make a drastic decision. And listen, if the Rockets were not on pace to make the playoffs, right? And I think it's not guaranteed, but there's a very high likelihood that they will. Then you could make the argument that, hey, to get that information, you've got to make the playoffs. So make a trade to actually make the playoffs, and you'll get whatever information you can about the guys that remain. If you were struggling to make that jump, I think it would make sense. But you aren't. This is, the first season where they've, really gotten a real chance at making the playoffs, and they are going to make them. And so there's just very little cost. And I don't think the Rockets missed out on any major opportunities. And I think the one that you could argue about is maybe the Aaron Fox. But it struck to me as that he only requested a trade because he already had somewhere he wanted to go. I don't think there was really a bidding war. It was like, oh, he wants out. Oh, he has a team in mind. The next day it's, oh, that team's the Spurs. And 2 days later, oh, he's a Spur. Like, there was no, oh, there's other teams involved. People kind of said, oh, the Rockets may be involved, or the Heat may be involved, but there was no real rumors about that, and that's probably why the Spurs got such a sweetheart deal for him.
Well, and I think from the Rockets' perspective, the concern, and I've had a few conversations on this, is about the next contract. The same is true with Jimmy Butler. So many of these discussions on social media are just abstract in that, hey, this is a team that can struggle to close out games in the fourth quarter. Let's put Jimmy Butler or De'Aaron Fox on this roster, and you'd address that problem. In the very short term, yes, That's fair. However, when it comes to building a sustainable contender, giving Jimmy Butler a 2-year extension for $121 million at age 36 with all of his mileage, that's tough. And De'Aaron Fox, look, he's a good player, but we've talked about it before. He's probably not a great player. He's probably top 25, top 30. He's not really an all NBA level guy, and yet he's about to get a 4 or 5 year max. That's the only way you're going to keep him. And you don't trade for a player like that. You don't give up the asset capital, even at a little bit of a reduced cost, if you're going to let him go in a few months and it's just a trial move. No, you trade for a player of that stature if you're going to make them a cornerstone of your future. And for the Rockets, as good as they are already, does it make sense to commit the future of your franchise to a guy like that who, while they would help you today, is not of the tier that they are a slam dunk value moving forward, especially if you think you are set up with these assets to go after someone like a Devin Booker, even a Donovan Mitchell, should things go sideways in Cleveland over the next year or two. Some will undoubtedly argue, hey, are they trying too hard to thread the needle to get the perfect guy? Maybe. But at the same time, if you are good enough anyway, you have the luxury to think top of the line in terms of fit when the status quo is as good as it is. And when you're trying to be the best team out of 30, yeah, you do sort of have to thread the needle. You do have to think upside. It can't just to be about getting a little bit better and helping mitigate a current weakness. No, if you actually want to win a title and to have a sustainable contender, which is the two words I hear more than any out of Toyota Center, it requires making some cutthroat decisions. And I just don't think they viewed any of these guys, be it contractually, in the case of Jimmy Butler and Kevin Durant. There's the age considerations. I think that went into why they looked at, but ultimately didn't go after Paul George last offseason. I just think, especially in light of how the team has played this season, there wasn't the guy at the star level that checked all the boxes. And so that's where I land on this. I know in the moment, especially after the Brooklyn game, I was frustrated on social media and wanting them to make a move. Look, Twitter is not, you said this earlier and you're spot on. Twitter is not, it's a real-time app. And especially if, in your case, you're staying up until all hours of the night. With me, I travel to New York, spend a lot of money and time. If you want real-time reactions, you're going to get over-the-top meltdowns at times. That's what comes with the drama of sports at the highest level. It's great when they win. We get really high when they beat teams like the Cavs twice and the Celtics, and we get really low when they lose to the freaking Brooklyn Nets, especially if we travel to Brooklyn for the game, in my case, or Paolo, if you're staying up till 3 or 4 a.m. to watch that shit show and waking up on like 2 or 3 hours sleep. That's just the way it goes. That's sports at the highest level. That's competition. That's the uncertainty. So I know at times for me, and probably for you as well, Paolo, there may be tweets that sort of, contradict this sentiment. Yeah, that's what happens on a real-time website. This pod is different. This pod is, the idea is to be a little more long form, a little more detailed in the analysis. And when you take a step back and you look at the macro, the 30,000 foot view, as we put it leading off the pod, I think it's understandable why the Rockets didn't go after a big name. The fit just wasn't there. And while certainly there are guys that would make them better, it wasn't so clear cut that it tosses all the other concerns to the wayside, especially when you consider the Rockets aren't just trying to be a better team. They're trying to actually win a title. And I think, that's something else the last couple of weeks may have played at least a small role in, is realizing that the Rockets aren't as close as we maybe wanted to think when they were stacking those wins over contenders in January. Not that it's dramatically different for the reasons that you laid out, but in a Western Conference where the Thunder look like a super team and aren't going anywhere for the foreseeable future, the Rockets are good, but they are not at that level. And the past couple of weeks, it's been a reminder of how fragile the ecosystem is, to go back to the way Ime Udoka characterized it. And so because of that, does it dramatically change the way you feel about this franchise? No. But if you were of the thinking that, hey, maybe you're close enough now that you just say, screw it. Get me De'Aaron Fox, get me Jimmy Butler, get me KD, get me that guy that's on the market this deadline that can address a clear deficiency for this year's team, and we can worry about tomorrow. I think what we've seen the last couple of weeks is a little bit of a reminder that while you should feel very confident in what Rafael Stone is building, they're not so close that you throw the long-term concerns to the wayside. They're sort of close. They're getting closer, but they're not at a point now where it's just make the all-in move and worry about everything else another day. We're not to that point yet. And I think the last couple of weeks is a reminder of that.
And it's not like you can't make the same moves next offseason more than likely. I think you obviously can't go get Fox. You could never have gotten Luca. KV is still there if you really believe that that's the move. But the status quo is going to maintain itself until the next. There was no move that I saw happen, and I was like, oh damn. For the long term of the Rockets, I would have loved to have that guy.
Yeah.
Um,
The Luka thing, just to address that real quickly. The Rockets, basically no team outside the Lakers in the game on that. The Mavericks clearly targeted Anthony Davis. Rockets had no idea, along with the rest of the league, that Luka was even remotely an option. So it's pointless to even go down that road. So, I get the frustration. I think the Rockets are among many NBA teams that, are upset they couldn't throw their hat in the ring. But clearly, Nico Harrison and the Mavs, they targeted Anthony Davis. They think he was the best fit for their situation. We'll see how it turns out. But from the Rockets' perspective, that's just a non-starter. There's nothing they could have done.
Yeah, and listen, you'll get to see truly. It's not just knowing about the guys that we have. We'll also know what weaknesses we have to address, and we'll have all our full pool of assets to do so, rather than make a move and then maybe even after that move it doesn't work, and now you're left with having to deal with some of your core guys to try and and fix those flaws. Like just going into the off season, obviously this is not a free agency podcast or anything like that. But you're gonna have free agents of the like John Collins type, which could be an interesting guy that to play the same role that Jabari does, but come off the bench because it doesn't have to be the starter. You'll have guys like Dorian Finney-Smith who will be a free agent. You'll have Chris Boucher, like Larry Nance Jr., just guys that can play that type of role that Jabari has. So that going into next season, now okay, Jabari is a key part of this team. If Jabari gets hurt, there's nobody else that can play the role quite like him. We need the guy with size to play next to him. Or you've tried a two-big lineup with Alper and Şengün. It worked well in the regular season. Now you get to try that in the playoffs with Steven Adams and Şengün, and you'll see, okay, if this works, now it truly makes 100% of sense to try and get a guy like Robert Williams and try to play those two together in certain lineups. If you go into the offseason and you say, hey, Jalen Green is just in the playoffs, he's just even worse. And you're like, okay, all right, listen, we've given Jalen for years. He's gotten a bit better this season. But going into the playoffs, listen, the guy couldn't rise to the occasion. And, we have to make a deal for the shooting guard or a scoring guard, and you can make that deal. There's a lot of things that you'll get to see that will inform your decision a lot better. And there's just no time to rush. And I saw there's just no reason to rush. I'm sorry. And I saw on Twitter, KP, who's a really sharp guy who I really respect, making the argument that going into the next few years, the Rockets, they should make the move now and try to strike while the iron's hot, because the Lakers are going to build around Luka, and you'll still have the Thunder, and we'll have all of these contenders that you won't be able to get past. And I'm like, if the entire aim of a 3-year rebuild was to have a 2-year window because we're scared of how good teams will be in the future, to me, we failed as a rebuild, and I'd rather, see what these guys turn into and remain and keep that upside rather than thinking short sighted and making a move like that. And besides that, I just don't agree that the West is this dungeon of teams that are going to that will not have any shot of getting past. I think if we have really special players and we have a really upgradable guys across the rotation, and as good as Luka with the LA boost, right, of the refs and all of that, and the league wanting the Lakers to be good, well, that may be scary, and hey, maybe perhaps in 2 years when Giannis is a free agent, maybe they partner up. But I'm not gonna build my future thinking about what other teams are doing unless that is a Golden State Warriors level dynasty. That's the only way you should be, the only type of team you should be considering if you're going to change the way you build your own team, try and beat someone. And that needs to be proven that it's like that. It's not, oh, we think this team might become a dynasty, and so let's just go all in right now. I don't think that's how it should be done. And I'll remind folks, listen, the West since 2020 has had, I think it's been 4 Western Conference Finals, maybe 5, and they've had, I think, 8 different teams make it. So the West is as wide open as it's ever been. In the East, you don't have the LeBron James Cavs. You don't have any team like that. So just be patient, build this thing the right way. I keep reminding folks and I keep reminding myself that nothing stinks more than tanking for a guy, seeing through his development, shipping him off to another team, and seeing him have success over there. Imagine how, listen, the Clippers didn't put nearly as much into his development, but imagine how the Clippers feel having shipped Gilgeous-Alexander excelling and being probably the MVP on the Thunder and think, hey, we had this guy. And he was, you have every right to believe he was going to be this good because he's shown promises very early on. Imagine how Mavs fans feel right now, how their star is playing on another team, and how much that would sting. So I just wouldn't want to run that risk. It may still happen if you do it in the off season, but I'd much rather have an extra playoffs of a sample to say, okay, at this point we've given these guys as many shots as we could have. We've seen you in the playoffs. If we trade you and you restart elsewhere, so be it, as long as we get the right guy. But the right guy is probably not a 30-plus-year-old star.
Yeah. And then as far as the lower tier deals that they made and didn't make, I think some of it comes down to the market. I mean, for starters, we talked about Rob Williams and someone that could be a situational matchup dependent guy. Well, Rob Williams wasn't traded. Malcolm Brogdon wasn't traded. So some of the guys, it's not like the Rockets didn't do anything. It takes two to tango. And in some of these situations, the teams that these guys were on just didn't think for whatever reason that it was worth their while to do that type of deal. The other thing that I would point out, look, the Rockets, for all the jokes we've made about the asset management crowd, look, they did only have 3 tradable future second-round picks before this deadline. So taking on guys like Jaden Springer and Cody Zeller, easing luxury tax burdens for other teams at, the benefit of a second-round pick. I mean, kudos to Tillman Fertitta, obviously, for being willing to, rent out space on his salary books to do that. But also, I think from an asset standpoint, look, this is replenishing the stockpile that inevitably you lose a big part of when you trade 3 future second-round picks for a guy like Steven Adams, who is playing a lot better in recent weeks. And so I think the bottom line for the Rockets, when you look at this team, assuming health and none of the injuries are believed to be catastrophic in nature by any means, I think internally they believe by the end of this month they will be healthy. Look, you get to the playoffs, you're going to have the original 5 starters to begin this season. Not saying that's going to be who starts in the playoffs. I still think Amen will be a starter. But in terms of explaining the rotation, you've got the original 5 starters, the 3 young guys, Amen, Tari, and Cam, who aren't rookies. Reed Shepherd clearly isn't ready yet, but Amen, Tari, and Cam, I think clearly are, and Steven Adams. That's a 9-man rotation of guys that absolutely have to play. Yes, I do think Cam Whitmore has emerged into that group. Kudos to Cam. I talked about Jalen getting them the win against the Raptors, which they badly needed. Cam Whitmore hit some big shots down the stretch as well. That's 9 guys before we even consider the Jason Tate, Jock Landale. I guess you can throw Reed Shepherd into that mix if you think that he might get going as a rookie, although I think that ship has largely sailed at this point. It would not be easy to have a clear path to minutes. Now, that's not to say you can't make an argument for just having a better option than Jock Landale as the 10th guy on your bench, which Robert Williams, if available, would have been. But the point is, if it's a role that's not even going to get guaranteed minutes on an every game basis, and the other team is playing hardball, because it's not like some of these guys that we talked about were traded elsewhere for peanuts, and you don't have that many future second-round picks to trade because you have made some big deals in the past for guys like Steven Adams, who I think we're both optimistic about, not just for the remainder of this season, but potentially re-signing beyond this season as well. And perhaps the injuries play into, why I saw some arguing when Steven was at his best in January, could he get back to being a starting level center in the NBA? Maybe from a production standpoint, but in terms of will his legs hold up? Probably not in his 30s with more than a decade worth of mileage. And so this could honestly be the ideal spot for him, where he could have that Nene role that he can, be a very good 15 to 20 minutes per game backup center, but not be asked to overextend himself. So when you have a deep rotation as it is, you need more tradable picks. It just didn't make sense for the Rockets, especially if the prices are high, which I think it's fair to conclude they were, at least relatively high, based on the fact that a lot of the guys we talked about didn't end up getting traded. then that's why you didn't see a move around the margins. Well, I guess there were moves around the margins. It's just rather than, upgrading the current team, it was to upgrade the stockpile of future second round picks, which, increase your optionality for future moves down the line. So I think that's why the deadline went the direction that it did. I think, in terms of these matchup guys, they'll also explore the buyout market. I think they're very much open to upgrading the 10, 11, 12 spots in the rotation. I think, they were linked to Ben Simmons, and I think that, the Rockets had conversations. It's just Ben Simmons didn't see a clear enough role here for the reasons that I just laid out. Who is he amongst those 9 players clearly going to play over on an every game basis? And who should the Rockets, I guess, prioritize less for the sake of a 28-year-old Ben Simmons that appears to have a chronic back injury? Would I love to have Ben Simmons as the 10th, 11th, 12th guy on the bench as a situational option guy? Sure, but it takes 2 to tango, and that's why I think, the Rockets will certainly put out feelers, but they're not at the forefront of the list when it comes to teams that can, offer a chance to win a ring this season. And they also don't have a path to clearly offer minutes to where a guy like Simmons, that even if he's young enough to say, hey, I don't need to ring chase, well, they at least want to play competitive games and have a chance to build their market for free agency. Simmons didn't see Houston, at least relative to the Clippers, as being his best shot. So I think until March 1st, the Rockets will have the option to add a player that's bought out somewhere else. They now have a roster spot that's currently occupied by Cody Zeller that could easily be upgraded. And so I think they'll explore, and it could be that, they end up bringing in a guy in the buyout market along the same lines as a Robert Williams or a Malcolm Brogdon or any of the other names that we tossed out and ultimately the Rockets didn't bring in at the deadline. But I would just remind people that it takes 2 to tango. And so the Rockets, I think they are very content and believe in the 9 rotation players that they have as currently constructed, the clear top 9. And so if you're not going to be able to clearly upgrade one of those spots, or you don't think it's worth it to upgrade one of those spots, in the case of a younger player like Tari or Cam, then it's probably not worth it to trade much asset capital to bring them in. And it's not worth promising playing time to someone like a Ben Simmons. So I think that's to sort of close the loop, because I think we, addressed some of the more proven star level names that were out there. And then as far as the lower tier, the matchup situational guys, I think they will explore in the buyout market. I think they did explore at the trade deadline. It's just, it's complicated as far as whether one of these actually gets to the finish line. So does that all make sense to you? Because I know you've talked in the past about the value of bringing in, I'll mention Robert Williams again as a specific guy, but in terms of whether it actually gets to the finish line, it has to be a blend, right, of not just the short-term need, but also the roster fit.
Yeah, I said before that I think Robert Williams himself, like in specific, made a lot of sense as long as he didn't cost a first round pick. Well, he didn't get traded for less than a first round pick, so I cannot make the assumption that he was available for less than a first round pick. And then none of the guys, maybe I would have liked a guy like Quentin Grimes to be a shooter, but clearly the Mavs wanted Caleb Williams and his, a salary that's, set for the next few years because they're trying to shave some salary. And so I don't think that the Rockets were really in a position to kind of make a move for Grimes either. That was the only guy that did get moved. I was like, damn, I kind of wish we got him. But I will highlight that the Rockets had. I've talked about this before, but I do some mock off seasons that are pretty detailed on with like 30 plus GMs or 30 plus people running it. I was GMing the Rockets, and I came across the problem that we have 3 second round picks that are tradable right now, and now we have 5, which means that you can make a 3 second round pick trade for a guy like Robert Williams the next time he's available, maybe in the off season, and still have 2 remaining in case you need them for an emergency. And you don't want to do a deal where you're trading a first round pick for 5 seconds, because that's typically the opposite of what you want to do. You want to have the quality assets. You don't want to be exchanging $1 for whatever 75 cents or whatever it may be. I will say that it kind of appeases me that at the very least we were there to take advantage of some of these opportunities for these second round picks, because while a small step, it is a step that will be valuable in the future. And it's a lot better than not doing anything and not taking advantage of some of these opportunities. And I will say, props to Tillman for allowing them to do this. They have done it pretty consistently throughout the rebuild gotten second-round picks for salary dumps. And so perhaps this time around, and I'm pretty confident that this would happen, but perhaps this time around when we are contenders, we will go all the way up to the apron, which is what is recommendable for a team to do
Yeah.
unless they don't like absolutely all in, and which would mean paying the tax, which I know is contentious amongst Rockets fans and in their beef with Tillman per se. So yeah, those were my main takeaways. I'm glad that we got those second round picks. They're not game changing, but they're fairly useful.
Yeah, and I will also say that some of these deals involving true contenders that spend, like the Celtics with Jaden Springer, are a reminder that it's not just about the tax payments, it's also about the team building penalties that come from the second apron. And that's another key portion of the calculus, in my opinion, for guys like De'Aaron Fox and Jimmy Butler, because as this team gets more expensive the next few years with the extensions, then to have a guy on your books who is, a good but not great player, yet making max money, that's very crippling to team building under the current NBA collective bargaining agreement, or the new CBA that's come into effect the last couple of years. And so I think that's making teams, it's a conversation that I've had a lot with people in the front office here in Houston, which is you've got to be very careful with the guys that you give those higher tier contracts to, because the worst thing you can have under this CBA is guys at max level salaries who aren't close to max level impact players when it comes to actually winning games. And in the case of the Rockets, sustainably winning games, building that sustainable contender. Paolo, in the chat, you just pointed out Bradley Beal as a perfect example of that. Yeah, those deals are crippling in today's NBA. Not saying De'Aaron Fox is Bradley Beal, but I think that's just a very recent high-profile example of a deal that clearly came to not age well. And I think that's what the Rockets are trying to avoid, unless the situation is just so overwhelming in the short term. You're so damn close that you can conceivably win a title right now by getting one of those guys, then yeah, you do it. But I think the last couple of weeks it's been a little bit of cold water. If anyone had that idea coming off the Boston game at the end of January, the last couple of weeks has thrown some cold water on that. And so when you zoom out, when you look at where the Rockets actually are, they're not close enough to where a short-term move like that, consequences be damned. It's not just about being willing to pay the luxury tax. It's also about all the implications that come from being a second apron team. It also limits who you can go after in the buyout market, for example. I think that is playing into moves all around the league. That's why some of these opportunities opened up to the Rockets, certainly with Jaden Springer and the Celtics. But I also think that it's a reminder of why the Rockets are being careful with the types of guys that they bring in or don't bring in on the trade market. It has to check a number of boxes, especially when, I'll bring it full circle and then we'll wrap up the pod, especially when the floor is as high as it is. Paolo, you made the point earlier that if they needed help just to get into the playoffs, then maybe the thinking is a little bit different, because you desperately need the ability to stress test the current model, the current players, and see what happens. But right now, even with the 6-game losing streak, even with things going so off the rails, they're still in a good spot. They still have a buffer relative to the play-in tournament, and they have a weaker schedule than almost all the teams they're competing with. So the incentive was not there for them to throw caution to the wind with regards to the future of team building, what their upside is down the line. That allows them to be a bit more selective, and ultimately that's what the Rockets did. Can't tell you for sure that it's going to age well. All I can tell you is that I understand the thought process. And while coming off the Brooklyn loss in particular, I was a lot more trigger happy at the end of the day when I, take a few days to decompress. It also helps I finally got a win against the Raptors. That helped the vibes immensely in that building. As we're recording late Monday, early Tuesday, I get it, even if it's a little underwhelming in the moment, and even if the vibes aren't quite as high as they were more or less recorded a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, with that, we'll put a bow on this episode, and we'll talk a little bit more big picture over our All-Star break pod, which will probably be end of this week, early next week. Again, Rockets wrap up the pre-All-Star break portion of the schedule on Wednesday and Thursday at home against the Suns and the Warriors, both 500 teams, and then have a couple of back-to-backs on the other side, but fortunately not until Friday the 21st, so that will give more than a week off for several of these injured guys to heal up. They expect Jabari to be cleared over the All-Star break, and because his conditioning is there, I don't think there'll be a long ramp-up period, if any, for him when it comes to playing an NBA-level game. games. And then we'll see with Fred VanVleet. I think they're just trying to keep him off the ankle as long as possible and then reevaluate where he is on the other side. Keep your fingers crossed because as we talked about throughout the pod, I think without that transcendent type of player, the ripple effects can become much more pronounced when you don't have a James Harden to bail you out the way Rockets fans are accustomed to. I think that's the fragile ecosystem, and hopefully it's a little less fragile when they are back to full strength, or we hope they are, on the other side of the break. We'll do one more pod before then, talking more bigger picture. What have we learned? We'll incorporate the 2 games against the Suns and the Warriors, which on paper, especially at home, should be winnable. I'm not going to say they need to go 2-0, but I think 1-1 is a reasonable expectation, reasonable goal, something they can achieve. And then they'll be in a pretty decent spot with multiple games of buffer relative to teams in the play-in range and ultimately getting into, at least one playoff series to stress test the model for the reasons that we've been laying out. We'll do a pod more big picture oriented in a few days, and then we'll get back into the nitty gritty, the micro, when the Rockets get on the other side of the break, have a little bit tougher schedule, but fortunately that will come at a time in which they are much healthier as well. All right. For today, that's where we'll wrap. And if you want more content before our next episodes, best place to get it, as always, is online. You can follow me on Twitter/X at Palo Alves, or at, sorry. You can follow me on Twitter or X at Vidubos, Paolo at Palo Alves NBA, and then this show at The Logger Line, where if you go to the Logger Line's page, you can find our link tree that's got links to our distribution partners, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you have not already, please subscribe, leave a positive review at your location of choice. That way you'll get the benefit of episodes right when they come out, and we get the benefit with hopefully your subscription and happy review of looking good to our friends, partners, and sponsors, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. If you would hit up their content and tell them that the Logger Line sent you on by, we can keep looking good to them and hopefully keep this program rolling as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with the plugs complete, we will adjourn for this episode. For Paolo Alves, our co-host and producer out of Portugal, I'm Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, based right here in Houston, Texas. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line. Go Rockets.